Hi folks, today I'm going to be showing you how to paint this Horned Hunter from Reaper Miniatures. Okay, so I've started off with the miniature, and I did actually prime this one. I just used a brush-on primer from Model Color. And to start with, I'm going to be using Model Color Black to paint in all of the bits that I want to be black. I thought about doing this more in browns, but I thought it might be interesting to have kind of the fur on this model be more in the black, a deeper range. So that's why I'm basing in with black, and then I'll dry brush in with some grays and browns to bring out the detail, but you know, really allowing those shadows to be very, very dark. And that is a tip if you want to not have to worry quite so much about shadows, if maybe you're not as skilled. Oh, there you can see the black painted in. Priming in black is another thing you can do, and that will just help make those shadows kind of be shadows. Alright, so now I'm going through with Idrain Flesh from P3 to paint in all of the body. I thought because of doing the black, I wanted a little bit more of a darker tone for the skin. And this is a really nice flesh tone. If you're doing, you can layer it over a lot of things to get a wide ethnicity of miniatures. I can't remember who I first heard about this from. If I remember, I'll put it down in the comments or in comment below. But I had seen it from another YouTuber suggested this was kind of her go-to color for painting people of color, and so I picked it up, found it works really well. It is a lighter mixture, so you will have to do a couple of different layers of it. And now I'm going through and dry brushing in with Eshin Gray. This takes, take your time. Don't make sure you're not getting too much on the brush. It is going to look kind of like you're not doing anything at first, but as you layer this up and get more on it, oops, sorry, I keep moving it out of frame there, you will see a bit of a difference. And then I'll go through and do another layer of dry brush in an even lighter color. But this, especially in person, really helps bring out some of the details on the fur on the legs. This is, something that you could do not only for this Horned Hunter, but a centaur, anything that is part human, part animal. So as you can see, I'm going through and doing a second layer with this Idrain Flesh just to really get a nice even base with this. Now I have used it layering over other colors, and I think that works really well. So now I'm going through with Steel Legion Drab again on the legs there, just building up that color kind of gradually. That's one thing I've found with dry brushing sometimes. The more you can gradually bring it up, the better it's going to look. And you will see I'm kind of like bouncing back and forth between painting one part of the mini and going and painting the other part of the mini. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is to allow the paint to dry on that first part before moving on to the second. You could also be going through and basing in all of your colors first, but I'm just kind of bouncing back and forth. So now I'm going through with Agrax Earthshade just to bring a little bit more dimension, bring out the shadows to here, and just trying to pay attention to where would the natural shadows fall, and bringing out that nice musculature on this mini. Just painting kind of all over, helping the shade to settle down into those natural creases. And the nice thing with this is with shade you can kind of move it around. It does take a while to dry, so this was actually one that I painted this section and then kind of stepped away to do a couple of other things. I had another mini I was painting as well, so I came back and painted a little bit on that. So that's another suggestion if you're finding it difficult to wait for the paint to dry. paint multiple minis, and then, you know, by the time you have finished up working on one, you can go back and check and see if the other one's ready to paint. Alright, so now I'm going back in again with another dry brush, this with Karak stone. You may have seen me dab that a little bit onto my thumbnail. I found that this works. I learned this from Ryan to kind of test out how much paint you have on the brush. Since I wasn't using a dry brush paint, it is a little bit wetter. Before you place it on your mini to see, okay, no, I definitely have too much, or I don't have enough, or it's just right, and I can go ahead and paint. Because you never want to have too much on your dry brush and suddenly go plop. Always try and err on less with dry brushing. Alright, so now I'm going through with a mixture of Idrain Flesh and Cadian Fleshtone. I have no idea if I'm saying those words right. I've never heard them said out loud by anybody who really knows. Yeah, just painting through, bringing up the highlights on this miniature, and I've been getting a little bit more into mixing paint, and you might notice almost all of the paints, except for what I'm using to basin areas, has been watered down. Been doing about a 1-to-1 paint to water mixture. This paired with using a wet palette, I find really helps make layering up those paints very easy. They'll go on a lot kind of bolder and brighter, then they end up drying down. And it also just makes the paints a little bit smoother coming off of your paintbrush. You can have a little bit more control over it than, especially with the Citadel, with how thick it is, than if you're just using it straight out of the bottle. Also, with mixing those paints, it provides a better, you know, I don't have this exact paint, I can mix two and, you know, have a new color. Alright, so now I'm going to go through and paint this cloak thing that he's got, and I'm painting that with Kantor blue. I thought the blue might be a nice contrast since there is kind of this really nice red undertone to the skin to contrast against that. Help bring it out because so much of the rest of this model does have a lot of warm tones. I thought having this nice blue, and I was pretty happy with it. So I'm just basing in here, trying to be careful not to get it on the parts that I've already painted. You'll see there are a couple bits like on the strap across his chest that I was not super careful about. I knew I'd be going through and painting that after I painted the chest, so I can go through and touch it up. Alright, so now I'm gonna go through and paint with Karak stone, paint the hooves. Again, you know, I'm bringing in a color that I've already used in part of the miniature. I've found that when you can do this, that kind of helps bring a little bit of a cohesive look to the miniature. You're not having these things that are, this is one color and this is a completely different color. It helps bring it in. So again, with another color I've already used, I'm using Steel Legion Drab to paint this quiver. Sorry about going out of frame there. So I'm just being very careful to paint the quiver, not the straps around the quiver. I'll go through and paint those separately. But just very thin. Again, this is watered down just a little bit. Probably not, this one's not quite 1-to-1. There's probably only like 2-to-1, I'd say, paint to water. And I found that works pretty well when you're basing. Gives you a nice, enough control, but also good coverage. Alright, so that's painted up. Now I'm going to add in a layer to this blue bit with Teclis blue. And this has been watered down. And just going through and painting those, kind of where the light would be hitting this bit to bring out a little bit more depth and dimension to this cape. It's not a cape. What would you call this? It's like a trailing belt? I do not know clothing terms that well. So yeah, I'm just placing it all around. There you have it. So now I'm going to go through and I'm painting the helmet of this guy. I decided to paint it black. I thought that would help balance out with the fur. Something that I picked up from other painters of the if you've got a color at the bottom, try and find ways to bring it to the top to bring balance to it. Oh, so now here you're seeing I'm going to go through and I'm going to clean up just with some white primer, clean up that strap there. So I'm being careful, and the reason I'm doing this is I'm going to use some contrast paint. So I wanted to have that nice clean white base. If I was going through and painting, especially a darker color, I wouldn't worry so much about going through and cleaning this up. Yeah, back to the helmet. I wanted to do I'm going to do a metallic looking helmet, and I found that having a dark base actually kind of helps the metallic paint pop a little bit more. So, you know, that's that, and bringing in the balance is why I decided to go with an all black. This does not look like the Horned Hunter from Pathfinder, but that's okay. It's my version. Okay, so now I'm going through with a mixture of black and dead white from Model Color. I started out trying to dry brush this, but I found that just trying to get in around those horns was particularly difficult, so then I just switched to painting it on. But what I'm doing here is bringing in the highlights so that when I add on the metallics, that will kind of show through underneath. I'm not going to have to worry about trying to layer in different colored metallics quite as much. This kind of adds a base coat. Oh, I'm forgetting the term for this. You can do a similar method with this with white and black primer, where you prime, easiest is prime the whole thing in black and then do a couple quick passes with a white primer from one direction, and that adds in your natural highlights and shadows already, and that will show through even after you paint in, as long as your paints aren't too thick. There you can see that shadow and highlight already kind of painted in. Alright, and now I'm going through with Skeleton Horde in the Citadel contrast. So this is one thing I've been having some fun time playing around with, working in the contrast paints into different parts of miniatures. I found especially for like straps and stuff like this, like some of those smaller accessories, sometimes it works. It's a nice shortcut. You can spend a little bit more time on, you know, I spent quite a bit more time layering in with the chest and arms, but this is a nice little shortcut that looks pretty good, especially on those smaller details. And I'm also painting it over that Steel Eshin Drab, so it's adding a little bit of that shadow and highlight layer there. I do want to play a little bit more with painting different colors over top of more than just white, but didn't do a whole lot in this mini. Mostly just used it for a little bit of detail stuff. And hey, that took me one pass. Didn't take a whole lot of time. So, you know, a alternate use for the contrast paints. I guess it's you don't have to paint an entire miniature with the same kind of paint. Use the paint how you want to use it, and play around with it. You might discover stuff that works really well and might not. But especially, you know, if you've got a smaller mini, something that you're not too worried about, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to screw this up, that's a great place to play around and experiment with stuff like this. Alright, so now that that's all dry, I'm going through and dry brushing on Blighted Gold. The reason that I'm dry brushing the metallic on was because I didn't want to have it too metallic. That would help lose the shadows and highlights that I did with the gray. And I just found that especially some of the, like this Blighted Gold has kind of larger metallic particles in it. And I found that sometimes just brushing those on, it doesn't go smoothly. You can't really water it down because that messes too much with the particles. And if you get too many layers of it, it starts to really obscure a lot of the details of the model. So I've been dry brushing, especially over like a dark black. If you want it to have different colored undertones, you could do it over like a blue or a red, even a dark brown, especially if you're doing like a gold, and it gives it a little bit more detail there. So I decided to do silver on some of the other things that I thought could be metal. Just add a little bit nice contrast. So not everything is gold, not everything is the same color. But again, bringing a little bit of more of a cool tone into this very warm mini. You know, balancing those cool colors and warm colors can help make your miniature not from arm's length or sitting on the table. It helps make it look like it's not just one blob of warm, one blob of cool. Now, depending on the mini, some animals it's harder to do multiple colors without it looking cartoony, but keeping in mind that for doing your accessories. And I guess that's another good point. You know, as you're painting it, I often am painting like couple inches away from, you know, foot to a couple inches away from my face, but take frequent breaks to hold it out at arm's length and look at it, because that's going to give you a better idea of what it's going to actually look like on the table. And again, I'm using contrast here on this. Again, I don't know the name for this clothing piece bit, but there was an element to it that seemed a little bit maybe more like it was made up of plates of metal hanging down. So I decided to kind of try out, as opposed to the basing in black and then going back through and painting the highlights in a gray, just start with the contrast, because it will give you those highlights and shadows to begin with. And now I'm dry brushing it with Blighted Gold, again bringing that gold from the top into the bottom. So I think this actually worked pretty well, and we'll probably use the contrast again as a base for metallics. It may not have worked quite as well on the helmet. I found the contrast doesn't work as well on large smooth surfaces. There aren't those crevices for it to settle into and the ridges for it to kind of draw away from. But pretty happy with how that turned out. So to add a little bit of dimension, I'm adding brass scorpion on top of that silver, just kind of adding essentially a rust to the silver, and this layering effect I found works really well for aging metal. Now there are rust technical paints out there. I don't happen to have one, or if I did, I just forgot about it. I need to find it. But I found that using this kind of brassy, rusty looking color on top of especially silver works really well. And then what I will do right now is I'm going to dry brush back over with that chainmail silver. So it's going to, those raised bits, the bits that are going to rub and kind of have that rust naturally smooth polished off, I'll get with the dry brush, and then you'll have that little bit of rust undertone to it to make it look like it's a worn, not a, you know, fancy, oh yeah, somebody spends a lot of time polishing this, but it's been worn out in the elements and it's gotten wet and hasn't been properly dried off, or perhaps maybe some of that's blood. Who knows? Alright, so quick kind of, again, decided to use the contrasts on the base. Just mostly as a time saver. So I'm using this Aggaros dunes on the rocks. I'd spent a decent amount of time on the rest of the mini and just kind of was like, you know what, I don't need the base on this to be super fancy, so let's see how using this works. And here I tried layering two contrasts over each other, so I'm adding in Apothecary White. I did also use the Apothecary White on the arrows in the quiver. That's the word for it. But I thought, okay, let's see how layering it does to add a little bit more dimension to this, because I thought the rocks looked a little flat, and I liked how this worked. It gave them a little bit more texture, a little bit more variation. And then I'm just using the Snakebite leather from Contrast to paint in the base, especially if you have one of these very textured bases. Using the contrast paints is a great way to save a little bit of time and still have your mini look pretty darn good. You could even go through and add some like little tufts of grass or dirt, or go through and do a little bit of highlighting, you know, maybe varying the color a little bit. Not take a ton of time, but that could make it a little bit nicer of a base. I thought this is perfectly fine. It saved me quite a bit of time and looks, I'm pretty happy with it. Alright, so there is the finished miniature, the Horned Hunter from Reaper Minis. Now this isn't the, you know, exactly what the Horned Hunter looks like in the Pathfinder books, because this is from their Pathfinder set, but it's a fun alternate version of it. And you could use a lot of these techniques for any kind of half person, half horse, goat type creature, centaur, or I'm forgetting what they're called, the half goat people. Yep, please let me know what they are in the comments below, because it's gone out of my head completely. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with how this painted up. Took me just a couple of hours to do this whole thing, so easy, quick paint that you could do in an evening or over a nice long weekend or regular weekend. And have something ready to go on your table, maybe a foe for your players to fight down, or a really cool NPC to join the party. A big thanks to all of our patrons, especially Alicia. If you want to support our channel, you can head over to our Patreon page and check out the perks of being a patron. I hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial. If you've painted up this miniature or used any of the techniques I showed in the video, I'd love to see pictures of your work. Feel free to tag us on social media, and you know, I'll give any feedback if it's asked for, or just be like, oh, that's really awesome. Or you can leave them links to them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, because we make videos here every week, and we'll see you next time on Roll for Initiative. Bye! I did not need that much footage to intro this clip. Whee!